Welcome to the STEM Pathways with Rohan Sharma podcast, where we dive into the exciting world of science, technology, engineering, and math. In each episode, we share exciting stories, groundbreaking research, and inspiring interviews with experts and enthusiasts who are pushing the boundaries of innovation. Whether you're a student, a professional, or just curious about how the world works, join us as we explore the endless possibilities of STEM. Let's get started. Today, I'll be interviewing Aditya Kesiraju, who holds a master's in computer engineering from UT Austin. How are you doing today?
Hey, Rohan, I'm doing very well. Thanks for inviting me to be on your podcast. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you. So to get started, I wanted to ask what your interests were back in high school and what led you to choosing your major.
Yeah, back when I was in high school, we had a computer in the house. So we were one of the few families at the time who had a PC in the house. So my brother and I, we were very excited. We would play a lot of games on the computer. The internet was just about, coming up. So we could get online. The websites used to be pretty primitive back then, but it was still fun. And when I went into college, in India, the way it works is you have to take an entrance exam to get into college. And I was lucky enough to do pretty well on the entrance exam. So I got admitted to this program in electrical engineering. So when I was in college, I took a digital design course, which I really liked very much. And there was also an introductory microprocessor course that I took, which I also liked very much. And I remember, I did this project. So there was this friend of mine, and for her birthday, I built a circuit which displayed the letters of happy birthday on a seven segment LED. And that was like a really fun project that I did. So that's what, got me started in engineering and particularly in designing chips. So yeah, that's how I got started.
Yeah. So once you started college, what activities were you doing outside of class?
Yeah, so college was really great. It was a very fun time for me. A bunch of friends and I, we used to hang out, outside of college. We'd spend a lot of time, just talking together. I used to have a motorbike, and I loved riding my motorbike all over city. So that's what my friends and I would do. We would hang out until pretty late. We would play cricket, and we would just go riding on our bikes. And yeah, it was such a fun time.
So you said you really liked that digital design class. Were there any other courses that you think led to the career that you're doing today?
Yeah, so there was this one professor that I took a course with. So the course was actually more, I would say, on like power systems. So these are like big machines that actually power the infrastructure for electricity generation and so on. So I took that course, but I really worked. I really liked working with this professor, and I was talking to him about the circuit that I had built, and how I was having fun in the digital design course and so on. So he really encouraged me to go ahead and start doing more of that. So when I applied to UT Austin for my master's, that was one of the influential decision points in my life at that point of time. So I applied to the ECE program at UT, and when I got in, I was actually surprised because I was a pretty average student, for most of the time in college. But when I got into UT, that's when I really started getting into more of like the VLSI, yeah, chip design, computer architecture kind of courses.
Yeah, so when you were at UT, what was your favorite class?
At UT, my favorite class was there were actually two classes that I took on VLSI design, VLSI 1 and VLSI 2. So these classes really teach you how to make chips. So not just writing the code, but also synthesizing the design, laying it out, doing some circuit design, mask design. So these were very fun classes. So these are also very project-based classes where you have to build a chip from beginning to end as part of the course. So those were two of the classes that I really enjoyed doing at UT.
And then while you're at UT, Did you like immediately know like within chip design which kind of job you wanted to go for?
Uh, Actually, no. So there are quite a few things in chip design. So, you can be a designer and you can write code. You can be a verification engineer where you're verifying the design. You can also be a physical design engineer, that works on physically building the chip, doing synthesis, place and route, static timing analysis, and so on. So at the time, I didn't really know what I was going to do. I just knew that I wanted to work in chips. Yeah.
Mhm. Would you have any advice for someone who's still in school, who kind of wants, who like knows they want to go into chip design and they're trying to figure out which job they actually want to do?
So I would say, anything related to chip design is great. So when I first started working in the industry, I started out as a verification engineer, verifying designs written by other designers. Later, I moved into design. So it's not like if you start doing one thing, that's the only thing that you will do in the industry. It's pretty easy, particularly in the chip industry, to do various things, to try various things, and then over the course of your career, you'll end up doing quite a few things, and eventually you'll end up developing some specialization based on what you like and what you're good at. But I would say just be open-minded, try various things and see what you like.
Mhm. So you said you started out working in verification. What did that look like?
Yeah, so my first full-time job after I graduated from UT Austin was at Sun Microsystems. So I was a junior verification engineer. So what that job looked like was essentially building test benches to verify designs that were being worked upon at that point of time. So I was mentored by a senior engineer at the time, and she was actually really nice, and she encouraged me to learn as much as I could at that time, since that was my first job. So yeah, so I did that for 3 years or so, and then there was an opportunity to go work on a new design, and I started as a design engineer at that point of time. And again, I was working with senior engineers who would mentor me, and who would sort of set me on like the right path.
How different do these roles look today with the advancement that we've had in tools?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, things look quite a bit different. Verification, for example, right? So nowadays there's a lot of like powerful AI tools also that are sort of changing how we approach verification, also how we approach design. But the thinking and the mindset kind of remains the same. So as an engineer, you're using all the tools, but you're the one that's actually making all the plans, and that's coming up with like how to do certain things. So the tools certainly help you, but the thinking is all still coming from the person. Similarly, in design, a few, well, not a few, but maybe like a decade or so ago, um, uh, the EDA tools. EDA stands for electronic design automation. So these are the tools that people use in the chip industry. So these tools started becoming really good. Algorithms also started becoming really good to the point where they could actually perform at or better than what people could do. So I would say, yeah, the tools have become really good, and they've started um, making people more productive as such. But the real thinking behind how to design chips and how to verify chips, that still comes from people.
And back then, did it still look the same where you're making these designs in Verilog and then like writing like very similar test benches?
Yeah, to some extent, yes. So the Verilog language itself has evolved over time. So there used to be a more primitive version of Verilog, back in the day called Verilog 95, and then System Verilog came along. There was the original System Verilog 2001 standard, which added more features to System Verilog. And then there were later versions of System Verilog, which added even more language features. So with each of these let us, build chips faster. They let us build more complicated chips. And similarly, with like verification and test benches, there have been, better and sort of like, more powerful tools and language paradigms that enable us to verify and design more complex chips.
So, did you like your designing or verification role more?
That's a good question. So, when I started out as a verification engineer, I used to love the job because I used to find bugs in designs all the time, and that made me feel good. Where I could walk up to somebody and say, "Hey, look, this is a problem, and this doesn't work." And I used to love doing that. I used to love finding, where things were broken. Slowly that also evolved into not just finding out when things were broken, but also, figuring out how to make it not be broken, right? So sort of getting more into like the design side and, trying to understand it a little bit deeper and saying, yeah, this is broken, but if this is what you're really trying to do, then this is how, you should fix it so that it's not broken anymore. So, yeah, it's hard to say which one I like more. I definitely, love finding lots of bugs. But, once I switched over and became a designer, I also love fixing bugs, which is also like a lot of fun.
And then in either of these roles, was there anything that you really disliked?
Yeah, so I always disliked, having to go to a lot of meetings. So that's one of the things which, when you work in the industry, you do have to do. You have to, go to meetings. You have to, communicate quite well, and work with people across, different sites, across, different continents and so on. But yeah, so having a day where there were a lot of meetings, so those were the days that I used to dislike the most because, these are the times when you're not actually like sitting in front of a computer and, writing code, but rather, you're sitting in a meeting room for like hours at a time, sometimes. A lot of meetings you're there, as a participant, but you're not really contributing. So, these were also like things that I didn't really enjoy doing.
So, what was your next role after you started doing design?
Yeah, so at Sun Microsystems, as I mentioned, so I started out as a verification engineer, and then a few years later, I switched over to doing design. Um, uh, After working at Sun for about 3.5 years or so, I moved to Intel, where I started, out as a designer, and I worked on several different chips when I was at Intel. I was there for almost 6 years. So that was a really good experience too for me. So, when I moved to Intel, I had gained a little bit of experience, but, there was still like a lot that I didn't know. And Intel being one of the best processor companies that has ever existed, it was a great opportunity for me to, go learn about how high performance commercial processors are designed. So I really had like a great time at Intel. Yeah, and after I'd worked at Intel for some time, this was right around the time when mobile phones were starting to take off in like the early 2010s. So I got an opportunity to go work at Apple. So that was really great as well. So having worked on really, power hungry, high performance chips at Intel, I went to Apple where, it was completely the opposite. So power was, number one in terms of, what we wanted to optimize for. And I learned a lot working at Apple I was there for almost 8 years. So that was like, another great experience working at Apple.
Mhm. So, throughout these roles, how different did it feel company to company? And was that difference because of the actual work you're doing itself or just being in a different environment?
Yeah, great question. So when I went from Sun to Intel, there was a big difference. So Sun is Microsystems was a great technology company, but by the time that I was working there, their star had sort of started to wane at that point. So the company was not doing well financially, and this sort of showed in terms of like how people that worked over there approached their work, right? So there was no sort of like sense of urgency to get a product out into the market, which was a very different, when I got to Intel. So Intel being, a commercially successful company, there was a lot of emphasis on actually getting, products done on time and, getting products out into the market. So that was a big difference when I went from Sun to Intel. When I went from Intel to Apple, that continued, but it was like, I would say Apple, in terms of how they execute programs and how they put out products like clockwork every year, that was on like a different level, compared to either Intel or Sun that I had worked at before. So definitely that was, something that was new for me. And I think a lot of it comes down to the environment. So the way things are set up, the way the company operates, how the management or the leadership at the company, how they communicate, what they want to do to people like me who are engineers, right? So I think that makes a big difference. And from that point of view, I think working at Apple was really eye-opening for me in terms of how well things could be run inside a company.
Mhm. And then, uh, like even if you did have to work more, did you kind of enjoy the pressure and enjoy seeing like everyone working kind of hard?
I certainly did because at the end of the day, you are producing something that's very tangible and that actually a lot of people are going to use. So particularly when I worked at Apple on the iPhone chips, a year or two down the line, you could be holding a phone and hundreds of millions of people around the world could be holding a phone with a chip that you worked on and that you contributed to, right? So that was very satisfying, knowing that. So, I would go up to family or I would go up to friends and say, hey, that phone that you're using, I worked on this like a couple of years ago. And, they would be sort of surprised to learn that because, people don't really pay attention to chips, or at least, back then they didn't pay that much attention to chips. So, just people learning about what is there inside of like an iPhone, and how it works, and getting to explain that to people, I think was really good.
So, what was your role after Apple?
Yeah. So after having worked at Apple for almost 8 years, I had an opportunity to go work at a startup called Rivas. So when I joined Rivas, we were a very early stage company with only like a handful of employees. So I was there almost from the beginning of when that company was formed. So at Rivas, we were working on AI chips. So this was in like the early 2020s. So AI chips, were beginning to take off. So NVIDIA was starting to do really well, and the demand for AI chips was steadily growing at that point of time. So at Rivas, I worked on the design of a AI chip that we built. So I worked there at Rivas for 4.5 years until the company got acquired in late 2025 by Meta. So that's what I did.
Mhm. So, you said that you joined it very early on. What was it like being in this like brand new startup environment after being at really massive companies until then?
Yeah, it was, to be honest, it was a pretty humbling experience because, sometimes we take for granted how much the environment contributes to our success. So Apple, being like a really successful company, and, being a really well-established company, it sort of like, sets you up for coming in to that company and being successful, which is not generally true at most other companies. So when Rivas first started, we had to build the culture. from scratch. We also had to build a lot of the company from scratch. So I remember, when I first walked in on my first day, there was no Wi-Fi in the building in which we were working. So one of us had to run out to Best Buy and buy a router so we could set up Wi-Fi. And these are the kinds of things that you don't think about twice when you're working at a big company, but at a smaller company you have to take care of a lot of these things. So yeah, so a very big difference, I would say, especially because this was my first startup experience, and I learned quite a bit from being in that environment.
Mhm. So how involved were you with the non-technical aspects of the startup?
I was quite a bit involved in the early days on hiring. So, we would interview a lot of people. We would go out to career fairs quite a lot and, hire people, young people to come and work in our team. Also, be involved quite a bit in discussions with potential partners and, with customers. I and a few other people in the engineering team, we would go out and, talk to customers and see, what sort of chips they were interested in buying, right? And, that would help us build our design. Yeah, so given that it was a startup environment, a lot of us were involved in a lot of things other than our core, daily jobs of building chips. And frankly, that was one of the best parts of working at a startup.
So how did it feel going from just having a few people to nearly 500 over those like 5 years?
Yeah, so Revoz went through a massive growth phase during the 4 years that the company was in existence. Yeah, so that was transformative. Seeing the company grow from just a handful of people to almost 500 people, located in various sites all over the world. That was really good to see. So building chips, it takes a lot of people, and what we were building at Rivas was, a pretty ambitious project. We were building our own in-house CPU. We were building our own in-house accelerator along with our own SoC. So that ambitious project required a lot of people to execute, and we successfully taped out a chip in 2024. So that was enormously satisfying to have all of these people come together and do that.
Mhm. So near the end of Revos, what was your role?
Yeah, so towards the end of 2025, Revos was acquired by Meta. So at that point of time, I had become an engineering manager at Meta. So I was managing this team of people that was working on the SoC that we were building at that time. So there were about, I would say, almost 30 people in the SoC team that I was supporting at Revos at that point of time.
Mhm.
And I continued that role, when I briefly joined Meta.
Mhm. So how did you like being a manager versus doing more of the hands-on work yourself?
Yeah, managers have a really important role to play, especially as team sizes grow and the number of different things that the team is doing increases. You need managers to coordinate all of those work and to support people so that they can do their best work, right? So when I was a manager, I would view my role as basically clearing the path for somebody, or clearing the obstacles in someone's path so that they could go off and do the best work that they could do. I was also helping people work very effectively across different geographies. So we had a large team here in the US. We had a large team in India and also in Taiwan and Europe and other places. So it's not natural to sort of expect a team to just come together and work seamlessly. So that does require a lot of work. So as a manager, I enjoy doing these kinds of things. And as an engineer, I enjoy doing different kinds of things. So I see both roles as being, very essential and very important in the industry. And both come sort of with their own challenges, and both come with their own sort of like metrics by which you measure how well somebody has done in that role.
So I know you mentioned you don't like meetings earlier. After becoming a manager, where I'm assuming you had even more meetings, did it feel
Yes.
different now that your meetings were a little more purposeful since you were the one leading them?
To some extent, yes. So, definitely as a manager, you are expected to be in like a lot more meetings. But in some sense, what you're doing is you are going to a meeting instead of putting an engineer in that meeting. So, you're sort of freeing them up so that they can go do their best work. And you're sort of taking on this role of like, communicating the team's work, to other people, right? So yeah, as a manager, I sort of embraced being in that role. So from that perspective, I didn't hate it, as much as I did when I was an engineer back in the day.
Mhm. So during your time at the startup, what was the biggest thing you didn't like?
Great question. So what I didn't like was the fact that, as a startup, you have to work really hard to establish yourself, especially as a chip startup. There is the competition is actually really strong. There are many companies which are making a lot of great chips, right? So what I didn't like was basically having to deal with like all of the uncertainty about, hey, is the startup going to be successful or not? Are we going to be able to like, navigate all of the challenges that we have or not, right? So being in that situation in the moment comes with like a lot of stress. And there are, definitely times when I didn't enjoy having that kind of stress, thinking about whether we were going to be successful or not. But ultimately, at the end of the day, if you build a good product, then there will always be a market for it. So you sort of have to like, keep the goal in mind, and that sort of gets you through the hard times. And that's exactly what happened with us.
So for my last question, I wanted to ask if you have one piece of advice for someone who's still in high school or college wanting to follow a similar career path as you.
Yeah, great question. So, I think I have said yes to things more times than I have said no. So that has enabled me to get into trying different things, exploring, different things in my career, moving from verification to design, and from, moving from being an engineer to a manager, to moving back to being an engineer again. So I would say, try things, see whether you like them or not. Nothing is permanent. Things are always changing, things are always evolving, right? So always good to keep trying new things and to keep an open mind.
All right, then. Thank you for joining me on the podcast today.
All right. Thanks a lot for having me.